I hope you can all hear me. Joining, good evening from wherever you are. And want to thank everyone for joining on time. On behalf of the Center for Economic and Social Rights and Akina Mama wa Africa, it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar, looking at from commitments to action, advancing an African feminist perspective on the Belém Gender Action Plan. We are especially grateful to really co-host and to our co-hosts, Akina Mama of Africa, and our distinguished speakers and partners, and all participants that are joining us from across Africa and beyond. Today's discussion comes at a particularly important moment. The adoption of the Belém Gender Action Plan at COP30 marked a significant milestone for gender-responsive climate action under the UNFCCC. It reflects years of sustained advocacy by feminist movements, women rights organizations, grassroots activists, and allies who have worked tirelessly to ensure gender justice remains central to climate action. At the same time, as CSR, we believe that it's important that discussion is quite very much timely ahead of the SB 64, but also ahead to COP31. We believe that this is important, an important discussion to reframe on the Belém gender action through a human rights lens. Of course, while the adoption of the Belém Gender Action Plan represents an important achievement for feminist movements and gender advocates, it also reflects some of the challenges facing the multilateral climate negotiations, but also notably the foundational human rights language that anchored previous gender mandates under the UNFCCC. So as CSR, we believe that climate change is not only an environmental issue, it is fundamentally a human rights issue. The impact of climate change being experienced through violations of right to food, water, health, housing, livelihoods, and a healthy environment. Human rights provides a framework through which we can assess who is most affected, who bears the greatest burden, and who should be held accountable. As we move to commitments, from commitments to implementation, we believe that this discussion is one that we believe we need to have, more especially provided the opportunity that the Gender Action Plan presents. We want to anchor this conversation today to speak to three main objectives. One is to deepen our understanding of the Belém Gender Action Plan, including its key gains and critical gaps, particularly as we look ahead to the SB 64 and also COP31. And two, to identify practical entry points for African governments, civil society organizations, and feminist movements to strategically engage with and utilize the plan. And three, to make sure that we contribute to building a shared African feminist position on what must be strengthened, defended, and demanded in the next phase of implementation to advance gender-responsive climate finance and climate action. Before we begin, I would just like to highlight a few guiding principles for today's discussion. We, of course, encourage respectful, inclusive, and constructive engagement throughout the webinar. And as a reminder, today's session is being recorded, but we encourage our participants to still use the chat to share any comments or reflections, resources, and questions throughout the discussion. You may also use the raised hand. You can raise your hand during the Q&A segment, but we would also like to leave room to also hear from you. So when the time is right, we shall open the discussion to all of you able to participate. So just use the chat to introduce yourself, share your name, your organization, and where you're coming from or joining us from. It's now a pleasure to introduce the rest of the speakers. I'll give a brief bio. We're joined by our moderator, who is Juliet Nangamba. She's a Pan-African feminist, who contributes in advancing gender justice and climate justice and economic transformation at the regional and global level. She currently is working for Akina Afrika as economic and climate justice lead, and she supports regional advocacy and policy engagement on gender equality and social justice issues. Our speakers who are here with us, Dr. Zoneziwoh, sorry, I may pronounce by apology, but Dr. Zone is a renowned African feminist leader, researcher, and climate justice advocate. She serves as a founder of the Women for a Change in Cameroon, for Women for a Change Cameroon, and has extensive experience advancing women's leadership, climate justice, and gender responsive policy processes at the national and regional and global level. We move on to Ms. Zukiswa White, who is a Pan-African activist, an organizer, and popular educator and culture worker. Her work is at the intersections of gender equity, racial justice, and environmental and climate justice. Her specific skills lie in building systems to support and amplify women's leadership and visibility within cross-issue feminist movement spaces. And lastly, or second last, is Maria Matui, who is a Tanzanian lawyer and a feminist climate justice advocate with over 15 years experience. And she's joining us here today. She has experience in human rights, gender equality, and climate governance. And she's the founder of the she's a founder and a national coordinator of the CGCCT and co-founder of Watered. Welcome. And Jackline Nekesa, Makokha, serves as a Kenyan gender and climate change focal point and has been actively involved in advancing gender responsive climate policies and negotiations. And she is also working with the Kenyan government in the State Department of Gender Affairs and Affirmative Action under the Ministry of Gender, Culture and Children's Services. It's a great opportunity to have you all here with us today. And I'll just pass it on to our moderator, Juliet Nangamba, to guide us through today's discussion. Thank you, and I wish us all of us an engaging discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Peninnah. Good afternoon, friends, sisters, brothers who are on the call this afternoon, and whether it's morning where you are, you're most welcome to this discussion on really deep diving on the Belém Gender Action Plan. But before we can go into our discussion, I would really like us to take stock of the political moment in which the Belém Gender Action Plan was adopted and in which it will be most likely be implemented. Our political moment really is marked by growing authoritarianism, rule, a shrinking civil space, and there's a rise of well-funded anti-gender movements. And we have seen that there's even increasing militarization across the global landscape. There was in Sudan, there was in the Congo, there was in the Middle East. There's also an increasing attempt to kind of roll back decades of progress that has been made on gender equality. And we saw this very vividly during the negotiations, both in Bonn in 2025, as well as in COP30, where we saw where the gender action plan and the gender negotiations were very highly contested. I think our speakers will also share their experiences, and gender became one of the key negotiating topic during these sessions. But we are in a moment where we should be strengthening gender responsive climate action, but gender itself is actually becoming a battleground. And we saw this, that it was even the word of what does gender mean being contested within the negotiations. We saw countries, Argentina, Paraguay, Iran, really argue what the definition of gender was and limiting it to just, the biological sex. Others really just sought to replace the language around gender with women and girls and boys, while others attempted to even remove references to interconnections of climate change to social reproductive health and rights. And we also saw that there was an attempt to actually just narrow the definition of what gender was. I remember during the closing plenary, I think the Holy See was booed because of all the high tensions that were happening within the negotiations. And we're also seeing that during this time, we see a lot of militarization, and we experienced that in COP, where I think the Women and Gender Working Group actually had to write a letter around militarization around the COP processes. But we're also experiencing that African countries are actually very high indebted, and it raises a question around how the Gender Action Plan will be implemented. So today we just want to gather around together as African sisters, brothers on the continent, and deep dive into what the Belém Gender Action Plan is about. I hope we will listen, we will reflect on the opportunities and possibilities, and explore what is required to ensure that the Gender Action Plan, the Belém Gender Action Plan, moves from commitment to action. Thank you, Peninnah, for introducing the speakers. I think we'll go direct into our discussion. I would like to call upon Dr. Zone. Dr. Zone, all of us, we usually have a very difficult time pronouncing your name. You can say it yourself in full so that everyone knows you. But I really want you to help us understand the shift that are there between the old and the new gap. What have been the wins and the critical gaps that we see within the Belém Action Plan from an African perspective, from an African feminist perspective who has been involved in the negotiations. You could also inform us or inform us around the priority areas, the activities that are within the gap, the actors that are highlighted within the new gap, and what are the entry points for us to advocate and ensure that this gap moves from commitment to implementation. Over to you, Zone.
Thank you very much, Juliet, and good day, everyone. My apologies, I'm going to skip my video because of my poor internet connectivity. I hope you can all hear me. Am I clear enough? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
You can go on.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so indeed, I mean, I love, and thank you all for the invitation as well. I really, really love what we are doing right now because this is actually what we should be doing. The gap has been adopted, and what next? It shouldn't just remain as a paper and then, 9 years later we meet again and then, there is another process and everything remains as a paper. This are proud of what we saw in the gap, but we believe that this is not the golden bullet. We could have done more. And from the civil society, women's rights perspective, we did our best. We did what we could do. And as opposed to the previous gap, as you all know, this is the third UNFCCC gap. The first was in 2017. I don't know how many of you took part in the process. I don't know even how many civil society women's rights organizations even took part in that conversation. And secondly, how many African, women's rights organizations took part in that. Then from 2017, we also had then a 5-year work program also, which, was the gap of 2019. And I want you to all know that these all stem from the Lemma work program as part of, commitments made by parties to integrate gender into the UNFCCC process. So this little bit of history is very important for us to track where we have been and the journey so far and the progress that we have noted in the gap, the Belém gap, which was adopted in 2025. So as it is called, particularly the Belém gap, because it was adopted in Belém in Brazil. And it's important for us to also know that prior to that adoption, there were a series of workshops, which was an innovation for the UNFCCC and for the whole process, as opposed to previous gaps. These workshops had, participation of civil society, in all their diversity, participation also of African women's rights organization. And the fact that it was consultative in that light also helped to inform the development and the decisions that were made in the GAP. And the GAP of this Belém GAP has 5 priorities. They maintain the same priorities like the previous GAP. So you have 5 priorities and 98 deliverables across the 27 activities. And the uniqueness would be, as opposed to the previous GAP, we had, aspect on care, human rights, health, violence against women, which were things that were absent in the previous GAP. And I will just recollect in one of the sessions where we were, making proposals and modification to the articles and the objectives of the GAP. And we cannot talk about climate change without looking at its impact on women, without looking at the correlation within climate and violence against women, correlation with sexual and reproductive health and rights. And one party member was like, what's the connection? What's the connection between violence against women and climate change? At that moment, we're a bit taken about that session. I was with Zanep. If Zanep is in the call, I would love for Zanep to also add into this conversation, because it was like, we could not believe that at that level, they could not understand the connection between violence against women and climate change. They could not understand the implication of climate change to access to basic, issues like water, the implication of that to women's reproductive health, the implication of that on SRO. So this was not just a learning moment, but an opportunity to also educate and inform the conversation. So seeing the process so far, and also noting that we as civil society, we could just contribute. We are not the one who negotiates. We are not the one who adopt. Because if it was left for us, civil society, I think the GAP would have been more progressive than what we have now. But we just have to contribute and then left for the parties, member parties to negotiate and adopt. So on that note, I would say in terms of the strength so far has been the way civil society have organized. And also through the WGC, we also have the African WGC. Through that, we're able as African women, as African women's rights defenders, organize ourselves to also contribute our voices into the whole process, which I saw that as a strength. And I think this is the time now for us to build that momentum and reinforce our activism within the continent, with opportunities coming up like the COP32, which will be happening on African soil. This will be an opportunity for us to really, build strategies and see how the commitments should translate into political interest, political priorities, and political action. And secondly, there are also sessions that are happening, like now in the SBIs. This coming week, we'll be having a workshop also around the GAP. So this is also an opportunity for African sisters to connect. And other opportunities are making submissions, either as collective through the WGC, or also, Akina Mama, you are an accredited organization, so we have opportunities here. How do we build on that and see that we really hold the parties accountable? And there's one important thing which I like in the new GAP under priority E, under reporting and monitoring. So there is an aspect there where it urges member states to voluntarily report. I think this is an opportunity for us to harness on that. How do we engage? Because they cannot report without consultation. So how do we build around that to see that there is, voices of women, there is voices of those who are directly affected by climate action. So there are pockets of actions happening across the country. For instance, for us in the Central African region under the Gender Equality, because we've also been having conversation how the voices of women from the Central Africa sub-region, integrated in the decisions that are being made. So I see this as an opportunity for us to reorganize and re-strategize. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zone, for really highlighting what the opportunities are within the gap, what the shifts have been from the old to the new gap, looking at the inclusion of care work, looking at texts around violence against women, also looking at the inclusion of women rights defenders within the gap. I think there's also a lot of opportunities, as you have highlighted, around the monitoring and reporting process, where African women and sisters can really contribute to strengthen the implementation of the gap. Talking about the new gap, I think we also need to take stock of what didn't really work in the old Lima Work program, so that we understand what were the challenges from that Lima Work program and gap, and how we can use these, understanding the challenges, how we can then use them to kind of push forward the new Belém gender action plan. To discuss this, I would like to call Zukiswa White, who's been very instrumental also in advocating for the gender negotiation. Zukiswa, over to you.
Thank you so much, colleagues. It's so lovely to be with you all. I'm going to try and read my notes because I'm always just so worried about going over time. So in terms of what I've been tasked to speak about, and I hope my network doesn't disappoint me, but it's around sort of like what went right, kind of, and what went wrong, right? So the Lima program before this new gap. And I guess it's to step back and say, how did we get there? What does this 11 years of Lima actually tell us? Because as Zone said, if we don't understand what worked and what didn't, we are likely to allow a repetition of the same mistakes for these next 9 years of the Belém gap. And so, of course, we started in 2014, parties establishing the work program, and the mandate was really simple, right? Climate policy is not gender neutral, and the UNFCCC needed to fix that. But before Lima, the conversation was almost entirely about getting more women into negotiation rooms. So kind of like a focused conversation on quota. And with Lima, feminists, including African feminists, their interventions over the years of saying that's not enough, we saw it there. So we needed the policies themselves to change. And so this shift from gender balance, so we see the shift from gender balance to gender responsive policy. And that was really the first win. And it held, right? And 3 years later, we have the first gap, and that gap gave that principle of gender responsiveness some structure across 5 priority areas, of course, which we know: capacity building, women's leadership and participation, institutional coherence, means of implementation, which is money, and monitoring and reporting. So it gave civil society a consistent framework for holding governments accountable year on year. By 2019, after a review showed that the gap wasn't going far enough, parties adopted an enhanced version with stronger language, more explicit commitments, and the 5-year timeline. Amended again in 2022, and in this whole period, essentially, what we have been seeing has been workshops, synthesis reports, appointments of national focal points in most countries, and a growing body of evidence on the links between climate change and gender inequality. That's not necessarily not useful. It's useful, but again, we weren't really getting far enough. And so feminist organizing inside and outside the UNFCCC did produce and continues to produce this clear kind of visible progress. And so we really did earn the Belém gap, but I'm tasked to speak about what didn't necessarily work. So firstly, I'm summarizing this, right? We kept winning language and losing money, or at least this is how I think of it. right? So the Lima Work Program and the GAP repeatedly called for gender-responsive climate finance. Climate funds and finance institutions were encouraged to align with gender equality, but too often this remained voluntary. The money just did not follow the language at the scale that was required. For African feminists, this is the central contradiction, right? Governments and institutions say gender matters, but women-led organizations, grassroots and community movements, rural women, informal workers, young women, and frontline communities are still not receiving direct, predictable, accessible climate finance. The second is that gender stayed in its box. So Lima was a real victory. So is the journey up until now. But the contradiction there is that because Lima created a specific gender agenda negotiation item, which is great and was important, it also allowed other negotiation tracks, however, as a consequence, to treat gender as someone else's responsibility. Because the finance negotiators are negotiating finance, adaptation negotiators are negotiating adaptation, etc., gender then becomes discussed in a separate, isolated kind of room, because then we have gender negotiators for gender, not seeing the mainstreaming. And this is really a implementation failure. And the result is that regions and communities most affected by climate change, particularly in Africa, had their specific realities addressed in one room, while the decisions that actually determine what money flows and where money flows were then made in other rooms without them. And so because the decisions that shape our realities as African women are not only made under the gender agenda item, they are in finance, they are in adaptation, they are in agriculture, technology, just transition, etc. And so if gender is not integrated, then what we will continue to have is visibility without power, without distribution of resources, and the things that make this visibility to matter and be consequential. I'm almost done. Sorry if I'm taking a while. The third is the structural causes almost were kind of consistently softened out. And what I mean by this is to influence the UNFCCC, our movements, our feminist movements had to speak the language of the process, right? Focal points, indicators, work plans, deliverables, reporting cycles. That was necessary and important. But I'm a movement person, so I'll always speak from that perspective that, you know, that level of technical process, we lost something there. Because African women, for example, do not experience climate vulnerability by accident, right? We know that it is shaped by unequal access in our context to land. Unpaid care work takes and looks a particular form: exclusion from formal finance, food insecurity, displacement, extractive economies, weak public services, gender-based violence in the context of resource stress and crisis. So a gender-responsive climate policy that does not name these structural realities risks adapting women to injustice rather than, for me, kind of like transforming that injustice in its own self. And you really can't transform meaningfully without having an articulate and particular context of what this looks like in different regions. So from an African feminist perspective, for me, the next phase can not only be about gender mainstreaming, it must now be about redistribution of resources, of decision-making power, of land, technology, knowledge, and public investment. Almost there. The fourth was that representation problem was documented but not necessarily solved. So we know the facts. Since 2008, that's where the tracking kind of began. To date, since 2008, not a single COP has achieved gender balance in party delegation. I think there was 40% of party delegates were women at COP30 last year, and that's less than 10 percentage point improvements over 17 years. And within that already inadequate overall figure, Asia Pacific as well as Africa consistently, show kind of like the lowest regional representation of any negotiation blocks. And so we are asking African women to be the subjects of gender responsive climate policy in a process where African women are least represented at the table. Again, a structural problem that Lima named but could not necessarily fix. Finally, from my perspective, is that national implementation under Lima was almost entirely incredibly under-resourced. So most African governments have a national gender and climate change focal point, but most of these focal points have no dedicated budget. So there's no authority to compel other ministers, no data infrastructure to measure what's actually happening on the ground. The GAP asked them to do the work, but also gave them almost nothing to do that work with. African delegations also faced, we know, the significant financial barriers just to attend meetings and participate meaningfully. And so that is just how thin the resourcing problem has been. Again, money matters. So as I conclude, what does this mean? It means that the Belém gap inherits real structural vulnerabilities, and this is what we need to be mindful of and informing our advocacy. We have better text, arguably, but we still have no binding finance, for instance. Strong intersectionality language, another hard-won victory. We must be proud of ourselves and the global feminist movement, but not necessarily name structural causes. So more ambitious framework as well, no guarantees that African women are actually resourced to use it. And so I think maybe if I close, kind of to say that the test of the Belém gap will not be whether it says the right things, right? The test in this 9 years will be whether a woman farmer facing a drought, a young organizer defending land rights, a displaced community rebuilding after climate disaster, etc., can feel a material difference because of what governments will be deciding in those rooms. And so this is what we must defend at these SBs. This is what we must demand before COP31, and really put forward a strong, mighty fight that is able to articulate these and prepare to defend them, and also kind of have a real understanding and analysis of what we stand to lose once again in this 9 years if we don't learn from Lima. And, you know, that is what it's going to mean to move, for me, from commitments to action. So we're not dogging the thing that got us, that was hard won. We're saying that we need to, we shouldn't be in this box where we must be grateful, like, for wins, and that language is looking nicer and it's looking more ambitious, but we're not actually moving the needle in terms of what it's going to practically and materially mean to have a gap that delivers for African women and girls across all their intersecting identities. And so the African feminist movement needs to, I think, embolden itself in pushing forward that we don't want another 9 years of nice language. We want the language that was hard fought. We all fought for this language, our sisters, our mothers before some of us. But what does it look like to make sure that this 9 years learns from Lima, particularly at the level of the kind of implementation failures and gaps that we've seen since Lima? Thank you so much. I hope I've addressed what I was tasked adequately enough.
Thank you so much, Zukiswa White. Please, if you have any questions, any comments, leave them on the chat and we'll pick them up from there. And then we can also interact during the questions and answer sessions. Please write the comments addressed to any of the speakers that have already spoken. And thank you so much for really, really dissecting what the differences between the old and the new gap, and what really went wrong between the Lima Work Program, highlighting the structural issues, highlighting the lack of finance for negotiators, for gender focal points, etc. We have now the Belém Action Plan, yes, which which is a 9-year implementation plan. But how do we contextualize it in our context as Africans? I'd like to invite Maria, who will really dissect or intervene around what our standpoints are, and also these standpoints that we take to the coming SBs from an African perspective on the implementation of the gap and situating the gap within our African context. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you. So I'll try to let my video on for a few minutes, and then I guess I'll have to switch it off. Great to hear from sisters. Can you hear me?
Yes, Maria, I can hear you.
Great to hear from sisters Zeno, Zukiswa. Wonderful. Not sure if I'll be able to do the great job that we've done, but I'll try my best. So with excitement, I would also not wish to speak from my mind, but rather I prepared some notes, and I would wish to follow the notes as I have prepared them, given the magnitude and the importance of the topic itself. So as we all know that African governments engage in discussions, but then the implementation and future of UNFCCC, and specifically on the Belém Gender Action Plan, is not only that the critical moment, but also I believe it's the moment for us as an African activist, African feminist, to really see how we align along the thinking of governments when they stand and when they sit in these conversations, to understand how much has been taken forward in the positions and in the discussions, the process that we've seen, how long it took already, and where we are, as how Zukiswa put it in our finishing statements. We might be celebrating what we have gained at the moment, but we still have a task to push forward to see that there is properly resources, financed, and all participation and engagement, not just in numbers, but really meaningful. So I guess now my video is a bit brown. Let me just do it this way. So as I proceed, I find for us an African feminist and participation of women in these climate processes, it's all about transforming the structural inequalities, but also women, as we all know, how disproportionately vulnerable on climate change, while the resources, decision making, and the justice itself in that bucket not truly be in the appropriate processes that we can say we are part of that. So now we have probably a tool which can facilitate this, but how can our governments, which be sitting in these conversations, and as also we know, when we are going to hold the COP in our continent, what will this mean to us? So for me, really what I think is we need as governments to push for adequate, accessible, and gender-responsive climate finance. Without resources, without the resources being responsive enough on gender issues, on women's rights issues, on all these issues that speak about implementation itself, we will not be having our wins as we might wish to see. As we know that the greatest challenge in gender action plan at the moment is the implementation, and this is because the absence of commitments and resources on how the gender action plan can be financed would also render the women and frontliners in the climate action also to lay behind in seeing how our own government, specifically at the national level, could be able to advocate, but equally dedicating the funding not only to women rights and feminist organization, but the grassroots movements and those who are in the forefront of the actions towards adapting and mitigating loss and damage and other issues that are all that enshrining in the mechanism of the financing for climate change. But for me, I also find our governments really need to look into the women's leadership and decision-making power. I think it was clearly spoken, representation of African women and how it is in terms of number, but also capacity. When we are in those spaces, what is the capacity of these women now who will be attending these processes, from our national processes to the global and regional forum? How are we prepared? How are we able to engage in understanding, in facilitating, in ensuring that the voices that are carried by this representative of many, not from our own countries, but from the continent as well, speaks to the issues that really will be able to turn the mountains down. But this cannot be possible if the numbers that we see happening and represented is the mere I would say, threshold of how that we can be. This not only just women, but we should remember that the Agenda Action Plan carries on young people, grassroots representation, indigenous and local communities who equally needs to be in these spaces to speak and to engage and to own the process, but also to see the transitions are justly being done and in a manner that their issues are able to be carried forward. So we want to see our governments really speak about the issues of women leadership and decision-making power in the process. The other thing, which for me, the third one, I really wish to see that our government, as we all jubilate on the issues of human rights and national gender equality commitments, but they should not continue to be what we have been reading and seeing, such as in other countries in Africa, the Maputo Protocol, which has been domesticated to now, the CEDAW, which has only been, I think, ratified in many countries. But what is it really transforms to actual and realities on the ground when it comes to protection of women in respective to climate change? This intersection, this nexus, how is it strongly advocated and defended by our governments to ensure that women, girls, young people, indigenous community are protected, not just within the framework of the climate, but all that which embodying the rights and how their bodily autonomy, their freedom, their voices, the violences that are happening to them, the injustice, economic injustice, sexually abuse, whatever injustice that is happening to women and children are equally able to be addressed in that proper, broader magnitude within the human rights framework and the gender equality commitments that we see can be really reflected within the Gender Action Plan. The other one that I really wish to see, and for me it's equally very strong, is the intersection of climate change and gender-based violence. And I think there's something which we do not speak about very much often, but I believe Zeno touched it a little, and also Zukiswa. We really wish to the veil to be removed when we speak about gender-based violence. It's not something of shame or something of naming that it's happening in a certain corner, but it should be appreciated that these violences are happening. And how now, as we're having the Gender Action Plan, what are these violences that are also seen happening within the spaces of adaptation, risk, disaster, loss and damage, humanitarian conflicts, all these areas? What is it that we want to see preventive and responsiveness of these violences happening in a sense that women, young people, and other groups, persons with disability, indigenous people, local communities are protected, but also at their preventive measure that are aligning with the Gender Action Plan, which we are seeing here today and discussing about it. Juliet, I'm almost finishing. I think you're looking at your time. And the fifth one for me, I think is also the relevance of how we can champion the recognition of care economy as a climate justice issue. I know it's a topical conversation now, but how does our government starting to own this as their own part of conversation, budgeting for it, really advocating for it, and seeing that it's not a continuous conversation which has to come from women rights organizations or feminist groups or young people, but them themselves as leaders, as negotiators, as those who sit in those spaces are equally pushing the agenda whenever as it rises, so that we see issues such as burden of unpaid care work, domestic work, issues such as clean energy, health systems, social protection are not only continuing to be the issues of NGOs to keep pushing forward, but ownership of it, really to reduce the burden that women have been suffering and been carrying it for years before and years continuous. How can we having this instrumental conversation during the negotiation and setting an agenda to see we are seeing the resources coming in, but they are going to the right people, they are reaching right people, and they're implemented in the right manner as well. And finally, I really, for me, wish to call for African government truly to see and demand what it means to be accountable and what it means to have monitoring mechanisms. because for me, I would not really go into the issues of that, because all of us, we know, coming from these spaces, what truly we are looking into as African continent when we speak about accountability and monitoring mechanism. Truly, when it happened that we have resources, where will these resources go? Who will be accountable to these resources? Which mechanism will be there? When it comes to representation, who will be representing these groups of people? Who will be identifying those who needs to be representing the rest of, let's say, indigenous community, in case that happens, when those resources are being now available within either our governments or within other mechanisms that can be available. So the accountability part of it is something that we really need to check on it, and we really have to make a mechanism that it will not really slide on our hands. What we have hoping and seeing it will making manifestation of a representation now comes to the selection of happy people celebrating moments, and leaving those who truly can be representative of many not being in those spaces. So the collective position, it needs to be very clear to ensure that the gender action plan really move beyond gender mainstreaming and towards climate justice. So I really wish to finish by saying that African governments, as they push forward the gender action plan, the adequately financed should be rightly based, accountable, and responsive to GBV as well, but protective of women, human rights defenders, and they're grounded in realities of African women and girls. So I think I underlined the realities of African women and girls to ensure that the ultimate goal is not only simply to include women in climate action, sincerely, but to transform the system that perpetuate inequality and climate vulnerability. So I am grateful to have this space, and I'm hopefully our governments will have the ear to listen, but also the momentum to shift the gears that we've seen has continued to suppress women in African continent, but working together with us to find the change and desires as we continue to demand for these issues together. So back to you, Juliet, and thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you so much, Maria, for setting the context on how we can contextualize the gender action plan, and also highlighting key issues around intersectionality, care and climate, loss and damage, means of implementation, representation, and capacity. I would now really love for us to turn to also hear Jackline give her intervention. I think there are some countries that have gone ahead in terms of implementation of the GAP, and even within the difficult context, challenges that we find ourselves in, and they've been, I know Jackline has also been very key on the African continent in negotiating for the new Belém Gender Action Plan. I think I would want to hear from you, Jackline, what you see in terms of adoption and implementation of the GAP. And we know that Kenya has also advanced in terms of what it could do and advance around the Gender Action Plan. Would love to hear from the case studies from Kenya. Where are you now? What are the lessons? What are the challenges? And how are you moving forward as a country in terms of the implementation of the GAP, so that we can learn from you and others can also learn on how they can take the work forward. Over to you, Jackline.
Thank you so much, Juliet, and thank you to the previous speakers. I feel like everything has been said, and I should just say I agree with everything, and we move to the questions. However, I hope I'll try as much not to repeat, so that we make it brief to allow for interactions from the participants. So just to reiterate what former speakers have indicated, that the Belém GAP, of course, it's a win to the gender agenda, much as it comes with some of the challenges that have been already highlighted. And maybe one thing I'd just like to remind ourselves, sometimes when you reference numbers or figures, it speaks better to our minds. So when you look at the Belém GAP, we have a total of 27 activities. A total of 27 activities accompanied by 98 deliverables.
And when you dig deeper into these activities and deliverables, in totality, the party-led deliverables are between 65 to 70%, while the secretariat-led ones are between 30 and 35%. What does this say? It clearly indicates that a heavy responsibility has been placed upon parties to deliver on the 9-year Belém gap. So even as we talk about matters, climate finance, the need for resources, and learning from the last gap, that is one of the glaring realities that we must contend with, that we have this over 65% responsibility for parties to implement, and therefore, there is no other way other than just looking for very innovative and strategic ways to access climate finance for us to, make headway and report progress as and when called upon. So maybe if I can just share in terms of Kenya, but also a bit of the African context, because quite a bit has been going on at a national level, but also at Africa level, which we belong to as the African group of negotiators. So in terms of implementation of the GAP generally, and I think this is informed by the previous GAP that other speakers have referenced, I think generally speaking, we can talk about having made some progress in terms of uptake of gender responsive climate policies. I think when you look across our continent, there's a growing appreciation of gender responsiveness of like our NDCs, our NAP, our climate action plans at national level, and including like climate smart agriculture programs, but also across other sectors. There's also there's been progressive growth also in terms of climate governance. Somebody mentioned about appointment of national gender and climate focal points. I think it was Zukiswa. I have a problem with pronouncing her name, and I think she's the one who mentioned that is not as important as others. Of course, later she says it's important. I just wanted to say that in my humble submission, I think it's very important, and I'll shortly share why. And then also other structures like interministerial coordination mechanisms, and of course collaboration between ministries of gender and ministries of environment at national level, although the circumstances again are different. You find that there are some countries where the relationship and coordination is very smooth, while some there are hurdles. And then about participation of women, of course, it's been mentioned. The levels of participation have been, the growth has been very slow, but I think we must just appreciate that as long as it's positive growth, we don't relent, we keep pushing for more. And of course, a growing focus around the gender responsive climate finance, I think that must also be appreciated, including even if there is no actual commitment like in the Belém gap, even that mentioning of the need for gender responsiveness of climate finance, I think it's a starting point, but of course it can be better through our subsequent SPs and COP efforts in terms of negotiation. So for Kenya, I think, appreciating what is happening in the States and the dwindling, commitments at that global level. Of course, we took one of the bold steps to have a homegrown national gender and climate change action plan. So we have an action plan in place. Why did we feel the need to have one? For us to really address lived realities in the Kenyan context, even as we align with the global and regional strategies. So I think that has really been a game changer for us, and we have successfully used the National Gender and Climate Change Action Plan to tap into local climate finances, from development partners, but also partnership with civil society organizations, just to help us be able to make.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Jackline. You can go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. So as a country, I think we pride in strong legal and policy framework, and so together with the already existing climate-related framework, we have been intentional in making sure that gender is integrated in policies and frameworks that are coming up, but also looking at the already existing ones and looking at how can we further strengthen them in terms of integration of gender. So alongside our National Gender and Climate Change Action Plan and the recognition of the capacity deficiencies within sectors of our economy, which are vulnerable to climate change, we have also recently developed gender mainstreaming guidelines in climate action. So these are just simple guidelines that can, guide any practitioner in the sectors like government ministries, departments, institutions that have programs that address climate impact, to make reference to, for them to know how to effectively mainstream gender within their programs and their policies. And then in terms of practical implementation, like once we launched the Gender Action Plan, we actually hit the road running, because when we were developing it, one of the issues that was brought out was the capacity needs, and at all levels, be it in government institutions, within the private sector, civil society organizations, and for us, government at both national and county government level, we hit the road running with capacity building interventions. We, of course, at a low scale, because of limited finances, we are not able to do very large scale capacity building engagements. But we sampled stakeholders from different counties and built their capacities on matters climate change, on matters gender, the intersection between the two, and then disseminated the action plan that is in place, but also had deliberations at that local level to guide them to come up with local level priorities aligned with the national climate gender and climate change action plan, but to address the gender and climate related issues in their local context, of course recognizing that again climate issues in different counties are bound to be unique in one way or another. So this we have done. Out of the 47 counties, we are left with just 2, to which we are planning to do between now and July, so that we will have covered at least the whole country. But again, as I said, it's on a small scale, so when we get more resources, we'll be able to expand to more and more stakeholders. And when we bring together stakeholders, we are very intentional in ensuring that women's rights organizations are represented, national and county level actors are represented, private sector, youth-led organizations, people with disabilities, indigenous communities. So in terms of inclusivity, we do our best. It might not be 100%, but I think we are not at a bad place. As I conclude, maybe in terms of lessons, political commitment really matters. And for us, I think, especially our head of state being a very key climate champion really helps even to cascade it within ministries. So when you bring, the discussions on the table about matters climate change, the leadership within the government institutions will not blink because they know that it's the president's agenda. So political commitment is very important. And then institutional coordination, also very important. I've mentioned about the need for cross-sectoral collaboration. And for us, especially the collaboration between ourselves and our sister ministry responsible for environment has been very key. Even the guidelines that I've mentioned that we launched recently were actually co-developed by the two ministries, co-signed by both the cabinet secretaries and principal secretaries in the two ministries. So we feel that close collaboration and coordination has really worked. And we work also very closely with the climate change unit of the National Treasury. Like this morning, we had been invited in a conversation on a biodiversity fund. And of course, for us, while on the table, we are very keen to, tease out on how, gender issues will be embedded in such initiatives. And then, of course, the appreciation that women's leadership is key. So for Kenya, when you look at our our collective in terms of negotiators generally across thematic areas in the climate sector, there is a fairly good representation of both men and women. But I just want to highlight that when it comes to the highly technical or science-based thematic areas, that's when you see that women are less. But I think with continuous capacity building and mentorship of more and more female negotiators into the space, that is bound to change over the shortest period of time. So as I conclude, I'm just aligning with colleagues who said the adequate financing is important. And for Kenya, we have chosen to really look into our local partners. Even as we push at global level, I think, empowering ourselves to be able to know, the entry points to the various climate instruments and opportunities for climate finance is very important. And therefore, our energies currently are at that, because without that, we'll not be able to implement the Belém gap, which we have, as I mentioned, aligned with our national level gap. So that's an area that we are really invested in, tapping into all available opportunities in terms of climate finance. I submit and welcome any questions or interventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackline, for your intervention and for sharing what Kenya has been doing around, political will, around cross-sector collaboration with other ministries to ensure that we're driving this agenda forward. With that, I'd love to open up the room for any, you can raise your hand for any questions, reflections, or sharing on what you're doing at country level within your movement, networks, what's coming up in terms of implementation of the Gender Action Plan. I'm looking out for hands, and there was a question as well in the chat to our speakers asking how does the plan strengthen community resilience to climate impacts. Any of the panelists can take that. Anyone who's ready can take that. Any reflections from people online? While people are thinking around the reflections,
Sorry.
yeah, you can go ahead.
Maybe for the question in the chat. I think what's with the Belém gender action plan, right? Community resilience has a strong opportunity to be strengthened because in the first place, it recognizes that climate adaptation is most effective when women, girls, and communities are or like not treated as beneficiaries, but actual leaders in climate action that, we are. It promotes gender responsive adaptation planning, promotes improved access to finance, encourages stronger participation in decision making, etc. And my point really was that if implemented properly, this raised ambition that we are seeing can help communities be able to better prepare for, respond to, and recover from climate impacts, for example, by addressing the inequalities in the first place that make some groups more vulnerable than others, particularly women, but naming particular kinds of women helps us greatly. So I think for me, it will lie down. We have the good, better language that was hard fought for, even though we know those of us who had COP that it was even now negotiating rights of, but there's a context there globally, right? But again, it's going to fall at how we push for stronger implementation and not only kind of sit with the good and the progressive language, even though without that long, hard process, we wouldn't even have something that really for many is lauded, rightfully so, as, a positive step forward in terms of its ambition and its progressive language. And implementation is going to be the difference to meet those ambitions, to improve and strengthen community resilience across the board.
Thank you so much, Zukiswa. I fully agree with you. I think it also just really names who is most vulnerable and is at the front lines, and how do we ensure that they're very visible in the policy frameworks. I saw a hand from Meta. You can go ahead and speak. Meta.
Yes, this is Marta from El Salvador. I've been listening with great interest all the presentations. This is very, very good. I just want to say two things. No matter how much we prepare to be in these events that are so global, and then we have to fight to even have a say, the best thing that I have found coming from a country where we have a dictatorship is to really prioritize work with the people. Everybody that's doing some work in the community have to come together and prioritize to educate the people to all the processes that are going on. Our communities are very resilient. We have been through 500 years of colonial practices and neo-colonial practices and everything, and the people still are there. So what we have to make sure is that they know the language. A lot of the language we use, they don't know, they don't understand. In our community, sometimes when we talk, they say, and what do they mean by etc.? Because they have not been given the opportunity on purpose to know, to go to school and to be prepared to participate as full citizens. So we have to identify anything that exists that is for the purpose of us being able to become the citizens and the governors that we are, because all those official people that are in administration of government are our employees, and we have to know that we have to govern. I'm just saying this, and the other one is that we are not talking about this as all these processes have to fulfill the dreams of the people to live in peace in a healthy environment. And that is our measure. And I am telling you, I am seeing what's happening in the world right now, and especially in the United States, everything is being dismantled because people, even those that have all of the education, they don't know how to be real effective citizenship. Africa is very key. All that is happening right now in the world is because Africa is at the end. That's what the so-called developed world needs, everything that is in Africa. And they are dismantling everything. So the moment will come that then, there won't be anybody to help us. So if we don't do it from the South, in our communities, it's not going to be, we are living pieces of peace, not peace. And when we are involved in the United Nations exists to prevent war and to make sure that there is peace. So I just wanted to say that because I keep track, and I am very happy that you're doing all that work in Africa. And we all have to unite to support Africa, not to be dismantled even more as it is and it continues to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, I think I fully agree in terms of bringing the community closer, because the community already have systems in place for the issues that we grapple with on a daily basis, and we need to amplify more of what the communities are doing, but also equip them. And I think this is also the opportunity we see within the GAP, because it works at many levels, whether at national level and at community levels. I think the purpose of also this space is to also bring that consciousness that we need to bring everyone in. It cannot be organizing the way we've been organizing over past few years. I think we need to bring more of our sisters, our mothers, our grandmothers who are actually within the communities, the people that we are speaking about in this space. I see there are some comments also. Thank you very much for the information and interesting event. I am Marina from Brazil and have been studying climate agenda in my doctoral research. If there are meeting minutes or recording, as a colleague mentioned above, I'd love to receive them. We will share the recording of this webinar with everyone. I hope my colleague Luke has been recording, yes. And there's also a comment that the Belém gap gives an opportunity for advocacy for funding grassroots women climate solution. If prioritized right by our countries, we have opportunity for strengthened leadership in climate action. We need to stand in solidarity and push in this agenda. Thank you so much, Ada. Dieb, good session. Please, I wish to ask, apart from education and empowering CSO, which we in Jen Eglilet are into, what else can we do with the gap? Apart from capacity building and education, what else can be done with the gap? Maybe one of the speakers can take that. The Belém Gender Action Plan presents an important opportunity to strengthen climate action by placing communities at the center of decision making. Yes, we agree for vulnerable regions such as the Niger Delta, implementation should prioritize locally led adaptation, climate justice, adequate financing, and meaningful participation of women and youth and indigenous people. Success would depend on ensuring that these resources reach grassroots communities and that are and those that are affected. I would have loved if people really raised their hands to just chip in and give their reflections. I would also, as we are coming close to bringing this discussion to a close, I also want to say that we are all preparing. Some of our colleagues on this call are preparing to go for the technical negotiations, which are happening in Bonn, beginning 8th to 18th June. I think it's also very important that we also recognize the broader movement, what is happening within the women and gender constituency, what are the issues that we are going to also be presenting at Bonn. And I would like to take this time to share in terms of what are the demands that the key demands and that we are demanding as sisters on the continent, but sisters also across the continent. I think these demands are also around gender itself, but we also recognize that gender is actually an intersection of the many other topics that are discussed within the technical negotiations. I think the first demand around gender is that we need to drive effective implementation of the Belém Gender Action Plan and action plan at SB 64, but this is only going to be done if we work closely and with the national gender and climate change focal points around centering gender, but also looking at issues that have to do with age, disaggregated data, and really advancing concrete gender action, responsive action. Around adaptation, the WGC will be pushing for a global goal on adaptation that is genuinely gender responsive and rooted in the lived realities of the women and diverse people and marginalized communities, delivered through the Belém Addis vision and the principles of locally led adaptation within the just transition. The women caucus will actively be shaping what a feminist just transition will transition away from fossil fuels looks like by building practical tools for advocates and governments and working with allies towards just transition escalation in 2026, including through the Belém Atalia mechanism, which we are calling the BAM, and the second phase of the Gender Just Transition Work Program. But also there's going to be push around making the COP governance process and physical spaces gender transformative, while standing in solidarity with efforts to address corporate capture, procedural dysfunction, and the broader crisis facing multilateralism. So these are the four elements that we'll see that the Women Agenda constituency will be pushing for. And I hope as we are going to COP, we will align with this agenda and our agenda as the African continent and sisters on the continent. With this, I would love to pass it over to Peninnah to just give us some key takeaways of our discussions and bring the webinar to close. Over to you, Peninnah.
Thank you, Juliet. And thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you so much for unpacking really very well the discussion, especially looking at the gap, but also what it means for any African who's out there, any organization, women groups, and also those that are in the space, civil society organizations across Africa, to understand the context of where we're coming from with the Belém Gender Action Plan, but to also delve deeper in also taking stock of what's happening on ground. So I really do, we pass it on behalf of Center for Economic and Social Rights, where I'm the climate justice lead, and also to Akina Mama wa Afrika, in being able to be part of this discussion. And to the participants, we take forward a lot of the key takeaways that have come from here. Mainly one is ensuring that we are looking at the aspects of gender and what it means to move beyond participation and representation, not only at the global level, but also at the national level, what it means for political commitments to be and should be made in seeing the case of Kenya, shaping a lot of what would be ideal for us to also look and position ourselves as countries and as member states, because we do still need a lot of priority to be taken into implementation of the Gender Action Plan. And of course, we cannot say that all this is happening within a vacuum, you know. There are so many issues that are impacting African states, but there's need for us to still push on demanding and having a strong voice and building a shared African feminist agenda is very essential. And that's why from this discussion, we are pulling out a lot of what has been discussed to share out to those who are going to Bonn, but also to create a stronger coordination among women's rights organizations, climate justice movements, governments, negotiators, and civil society actors to advance a transformative vision of gender and climate justice that reflects African realities and priorities. So for us from CSR and Akina Mama Africa, we are just trying to make this a usual discussion, but also to move from just us discussing it, but to borrow a leaf and ideas from countries that are going ahead to have their gender action plans and what this means in the tech of implementation. So we definitely see that today's discussion is definitely looking at much more than just seeing how to amplify voices, but also to carry the realities of so many challenges that are happening, and also the positive things that are happening that we could look at in implementing the gender action plan. So all that you've shared, all that you've been able to amplify here, we are also building on to have more of these discussions on advancing an African feminist perspective on the Belém Gender Action Plan. So ahead of Bonn, but also ahead of COP. So please stay forward to seeing more of these discussions and help us to try to also move forward to also attempting to also engage with our national focal point people. If you know you're in a country or in any state, you can be able to pick interest to see what are your countries doing about the gender action plan and whether they have their own national action plans. And if they can borrow any ideas that we can share here, that we can be able to reach to within our member states as well. So from us, we would like to say thank you and would like to continue saying that we need to center human rights as well in this discussion, that there's a need to advance and have human rights remain at the center of the GAP implementation. So it is really foundational because we see that there is need to actually strengthen the language and also to address the bits of equality, participation, accountability, and also look at the redistribution of resources equally. So thank you so much. Over to you, Julie. I think we can close.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that was the closing. And thanks so much for participating, for your contributions. Watch out for the recording of the webinar. Bye.